Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the second of 4 conversations on climate teaching and education. Our goal over these 4 weeks of the workshop sessions is to identify and understand and address education needs around capacity building in both the academy and the community. What we need all college graduates to understand about climate, that's our topic for today. What students entering the market as climate experts should learn. And finally, how we ensure that our necessary transition to carbon neutrality can be just. My name is Kelly Eskew. I'm a clinical professor of business law and ethics at the Indiana University Kelley School of Business, and I teach primarily human rights, sustainability, and climate law and policy. In a minute, I will introduce our distinguished panel for today. Now, before we start, I want to share some Zoom tips. As this slide shows, first I should tell you all that this session will be recorded, and we're going to record our breakout sessions in a bit as well. All participants have joined us on mute. If you'd like to actively engage in the workshop, please feel free to unmute yourself when you go into the breakout session in order to participate. We invite all of you to do that. You're also invited to type questions and comments and introduce yourselves to each other in the chat box, and you can simply click that on the toolbar. I think we're all Zoom experts at this point. To raise your hand to participate, feel free to go to the participants button, find your name, and click on the raise hand. And for everyone joining us today, there's 2 different ways to view your screen. We'll stop sharing the slides in just a moment. You can either look at the speaker view, which puts the speaker in the big window, or you can click gallery view, which is sort of the Brady Bunch look. We have called today's session Teaching Climate Across the Curriculum. And I want to start today with some discussion with the panel, then we'll hopefully get into breakout rooms for some small group discussion before we wrap up. Let me introduce my panel. And I will apologize to them in advance that these are very abbreviated introductions because they have such a wealth of experience and accomplishments. But Dr. Catherine Manduca is the director of the Science Education Resource Center at Carleton College. Her work and the work of the SCRC supports communities of educators in learning together and collaborating. And her research focuses on understanding faculty learning and the impact of professional networks on educational practice. Kathy was the executive director of the National Association of Geoscience Teachers from 2007 to 2019. She serves on the Board of Science Education and the LabX Advisory Board for the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. She is a past recipient of the American Geophysical Union's Award for Excellence in Earth and Space Education. Dr. Eduardo Brandisio is a distinguished professor of anthropology at Indiana University, and he directs the Center for the Analysis of Social Ecological Landscapes. He has developed a research program in environmental anthropology that's collaborative, international, interdisciplinary, and problem-oriented. Eduardo has served on numerous international scientific bodies, including as co-chair of the 2016 through 2019 Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Dr. Michael Wysession is a professor of geophysics at Washington University in St. Louis. He has authored or co-authored over 100 papers and reports on geophysics and science education and over 35 textbooks ranging from grade school to graduate school. Michael was the chair of the National Science Foundation's Earth Science Literacy Initiative, chair of Earth and Space Science for the National Academy of Science report, a framework for K-12 science education, and one of the lead architects of the new National K-12 Next Generation Science Standards. Michael also co-authored the National Science Teacher Association's position paper on teaching about climate change. Michael has been recognized for his scientific and educational work with the Packard Foundation's Science and Engineering Fellowship, the NSF's Presidential Faculty Fellowship, the Innovation Award from the St. Louis Science Academy, the Inaugural Ambassador Award from the American Geophysical Union, and the Frank Press Award from the Seismological Society of America. So we have a great panel with us today. And I thank you all for joining us. Let's just jump right into our questions. So Michael, we have an interdisciplinary panel and we're seeking answers about how we educate about climate change across disciplines. In other words, how do you teach and think about climate change in a way that has perhaps implications for all disciplines?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I'll just say sort of three quick points. One thing that we found was really important at a K-12 level, and I think it applies in undergraduate certainly as well, is teaching through storylines. It's based on something called the phenomenon-based learning approach, where you use essential questions that are broad and of general importance, and you use those to tie content from a variety of areas together. And the trick is to find engaging storylines around which you reinforce student learning. And climate makes great storylines, whatever the topic is. And to give you an example, we've just completed a national high school chemistry program where almost all of the storylines are climate related. So yes, we do chemical reactions, but the storyline is the combustion of fossil fuels and the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We talk about acids and bases, but the storyline is ocean acidification and the damage to the coral reefs. And this works, of course, across all disciplines because you can look at the rise and fall of civilizations, the sort of migrations of humans across the past 10,000 years across Earth, anthropology, history, all these areas, climate makes great storylines. And that brings me to the second point, which is it's really critical in this approach that we not try to think of teaching climate, as a course, like you're going to take a course on climate and climate change. Because just as climate exists across all of our lives in so many different ways, so it should be distributed across the whole curriculum. If you want to teach the science of climate, well, you have to look at heliophysics with the fluctuations of output from the sun, planetary perturbations, which change the Milankovitch cycles and give us our ice ages, radiation physics, atmospheric chemistry, biosphere feedbacks, and then you get into human activities where economics, politics, history, social dynamics all come into play in a variety of complex ways. So it is critical that we view this as a glue, as a storyline that can cover nearly the entire curriculum at a university. And the last thing I'll say is, as a means of doing this, I think at Washington University, we took a very important step in creating a program called the Washington University Climate Change Program, where we have, amongst other things, we're involved with outreach and science as well, but we have begun to look across our curriculum and identify those courses where climate is taught and also identify its connections to energy, to health, and to pull that list together to make it available for students. And then the next step is to build the ties between the instructors to get them talking. We did this very successfully with an environmental studies program where faculty across many different schools would get together Friday mornings for bagels and cream cheese and some kind of discussion. And it became a highlight of my week until the pandemic hit. That sort of approach we need to take as well with climate, to pull instructors together so that we can really work together on integrating this curriculum. It already exists across the entire university. And the next step is to integrate that a little bit better.
Michael, what a wonderful response to get us started today. I appreciate that very much. Kathy, let me come to you. How do we teach and think about climate across disciplines?
Oh, thank you. And I want to say thank you again for the opportunity to speak, and Michael, for the opportunity to follow you, and Eduardo to come before you, I guess. So when I think about climate and higher education, I'm one of these sort of first principle people. So I sort of back up to what are we trying to do in higher education? And of course, we're trying to do lots of things in higher education, but I think one of the important things that we're trying to do, well, all the things we're trying to do are important, but one of them is to educate people in a way and prepare them to be able to live a life that is successful, sustainable, and just, both individually and collectively. So we're trying to create individuals and a society that can live successfully, sustainably, and justly. And to me, successfully is about the present. That's about living it's about creating individuals and communities and a nation where on a day-to-day, you're not threatened by having your house burned up, flooded away, falling into the creek because the banks are eroding. It's about having enough food. It's about having access to healthcare. It's all about the day-to-day. And it's also about being able to be happy, which has there's lots of different ways in which education helps one be happy, not just circumstantial, but intellectually. So that's, to me, what we're trying to do. And climate education, to me, is really, and environment, understanding the earth we live on is like, it has to be at the center of that all the way across, because it's the context in which we live, right? So no matter what we're studying, we're in the middle of that context. So that's the sort of framing, to me. It's a central part, it's a central narrative, it's a central piece of the education across the higher order learning that one would expect all students to leave with. Just like I think critical thinking is a higher order thing we expect all students to live with. So what does that mean for the specifics of climate education? What does that mean? I thought Michael would talk about, but I will say, since he didn't, I think that having a systems perspective, which he described, is an essential piece of that. Understanding that the earth is a system, the humans are part of that system, as is all of life on earth, and that that system is a complex system. It's difficult to understand accurately. It's difficult to forecast accurately. It has the property that, as all complex systems do, that you can expect to find responses that are delayed in time and delayed in space and are complicated, and that may be damped or accelerated or exacerbated over time. So getting to that kind of stance, so that when we're thinking about all the things we do in all of our classes and all the things we learn, we are thinking in a context of that system. So that would be one piece to me. The other thing I want to say is that it's not enough, if our goal is to live successfully, sustainably, and justly, it's not sufficient to just have knowledge. One has to have the capacity to act. So I think that's the other big piece of thinking about climate education for me, is thinking about how you develop that capacity to act and what that means. And I think that has to do with being able to evaluate solutions and their impact on you, on others, on the problem. It's about empathy and ethics. It's about understanding how one works in our social system and uses and participates in government and participates in and understands the business world. And it's about getting some practice acting. So I'll stop there.
It's wonderful. Our first session, I'd know, back on October 9th, dealt somewhat with capacity building. So for any participants that weren't able to attend, that recording should be available for you, I hope. Eduardo, let me now turn to you with the same question. And I see you're going to share some slides with us and your response to our question.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity as well, and welcome all the participants. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really happy actually to follow Michael and Kathy, because I think they laid the ground very well. One, about both of them talk about a systems perspective, that you cannot separate the climate from other aspects of our life. And these are my 3 points, and I'll maybe be able to illustrate further depending on the time. The first part of that system perspective, and also I think the larger narrative that Michael was talking about, is that climate change, development, and the remaining deterioration of the environment are all interconnected. And I think that's a really key point that the students need to take, not to isolate climate change from these broader societal processes that have been taking for a long time. And together they have compounding effects. And that's why we talk so much about climate change and their impacts on our lives, because it interacts with environmental issues, with inequality, and that makes it have such a large impact in our lives. The second part is that climate change impacts, as any other kinds of impacts, are unevenly distributed. People suffer more in different parts of the world, and we see in the US and we see in other countries. It's highly unequal how it affects people, and that's a really important part of how students should think about it, because this affects what kind of solutions I think people can think about it. And that takes to the third point. To approach climate change as an issue, you have to approach synergistically with other issues, and therefore use it and leverage on it to also impact other aspects of people's lives, from the economy to the quality of life that Kathy was talking about. So I think these are three larger points that I think help also to frame a larger narrative that get us to think for a longer time perspective. There are other points that I put on the side here that I think students should also know. The basics and the facts of climate change, because that is an important aspect of debating and discussing it, given that there's so much fake news and so much, conspiracy issues about it. The history of climate denialism, it's a really important thing for us to know, because it affects many other aspects of our lives, not only climate. The same strategy for denial that is used in climate is used for other issues that affect us differently. And the point that climate change interacts with other aspects, and that solutions, local solutions matter a lot. The fact that it's much slower to find solutions at a higher international level shouldn't stop people from doing what they can and from improving their lives at their local levels, because that has the double benefit of contributing to the larger mitigation of climate change, but also improving local conditions, where people live. I think I have still a little bit of time, so I'll just illustrate some materials that I use in my class that I find very useful to talk to students about, this longer term perspective and how climate is part of a variety of other societal processes that are contributing to it. So I use the Great Acceleration concept, which is a summary of trends, in this case, socioeconomic trends since the late 1900s or the late 1800s, but particularly showing how after the Second War, we have this significant exponential change in many social indicators that end up accumulating at the global level to have the kinds of problems that we have. The other aspect of it is I do not have time to discuss that here, but those trends vary enormously from regions and across development categories of countries. And there is a shift now in where those impacts are taking place. And they have, of course, what we're talking about, all the environmental consequences, that correlate with the kind of socioeconomic trends that we see. So, final point. The human imprint on the earth is much bigger than climate change, and all those things interact. And we need to appreciate the complexity of environmental problems that we have, and they scale. If you look on the bottom of the slide, they scale of human impact on the planet. So we appreciate, how to deal with climate change in the context of dealing with other issues as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo, very much. I'm going to shift us a little bit, and you can see already from our first 15 minutes why you never have enough time for these conversations. But Kathy, let me come back to you with this question. How do we incorporate important concepts of diversity and inclusion into this teaching, into what we're achieving as we teach across the curriculum, and why do we need to do it?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question to get to respond to. And Eduardo, I think you set up my my response very well there. We are all, I think that diversity and equity are foundational, they're very central to both understanding and acting in the world that we live in, climate and its impacts and beyond. And to me, that is driven by the fact that we live in one Earth system. So everything any one of us does impacts all of us. And the impacts are not felt evenly. They're not felt evenly because of where you live, and they're not felt evenly because of who you are and where you are in our social system. And to me, that means that if we're going to understand and act justly, or even successfully and sustainably, we have to all be operating in that context. And so that to me is as foundational as understanding the role of CO2 in the atmosphere. So to me, it's just right at the middle. The other thing I want to say, which overlaps, it starts out from a sort of addressing the question of what scientists should learn, but I think it's really central to what everybody should learn, is that science is powerful. That means that's important who the scientists are. It means it's important who has the ability to act on that science and use it to create solutions. And it matters who understands that science is is a central part of understanding and acting in our current condition. I don't want to suggest that science is everything. I mean, I think it's science. Everybody has to be in a place where they understand the roles of science and values and society and civics and all of those things and how they come together. And they have to have empathy and a variety of other things. But if they don't understand that science is the utility and value of science, then they don't have access to those solutions or to that information. And that, to me, is part of the inequity of the current situation.
Thank you so much for that. Eduardo, let me come to you with this question of diversity and inclusion. How do you see that fitting into what we need to teach all college students about climate?
I think Kathy did a great job there. I'll highlight 2 points. When you talk about solutions in particular, they need to be fit into context. So, solutions should be discussed with the people being affected by them. And that requires participatory approaches, participatory methods, and understanding the context in which, people are facing the problems that they're facing. I think there's another component of that, which is leveraging on the creativity of people. I mean, I work in my current project in the Amazon is about local initiatives of sustainability. And you just open that door and you find people with incredible ideas and incredible solutions at the local level that sometimes are invisible because they're not included in the table, when you talk about those issues. So those are 2 aspects. The third aspect that I'm going to mention is the role of Indigenous people globally in dealing with environmental issues and climate issues. And they are often outside of the picture. But you need to think, if you think globally, a quarter of the Earth's surface is managed or held by Indigenous people. And these are the areas where we have the most preserved, biodiversity and nature on the planet. At the same time, these are some of the areas where you're having the fastest change due to climate change and due to other issues. And that could be the Arctic, or could be the Andes, or could be the Himalayas, or could be the Amazon and other, tropical areas. So these are areas that are hotspot for climate change. They have a major role to play in supporting solutions to climate change, and they're not often sitting on the table. So with that.
Thank you. And I'm sorry that I didn't mention as we started, Eduardo just alluded to it, but he's been committed for 3 decades to research on human environment interaction and social environmental change in the Amazon region. So his research very much ties into everything that we're discussing today. Michael, let me come to you with our question on diversity and inclusion and get your thoughts.
Sure. First of all, I want to send a huge thank you to Kathy. Some years back, she invited me to be a co-PI on a very successful NSF-funded project called On the Cutting Edge that had grown so large that the original PIs wanted a few more PIs to help run the program. And I had the honor of being part of that for 5 years. And I think I was invited largely because of my research at the time. And I honestly knew nothing about pedagogy, even though I'd been teaching for 30 years. And through Kathy and what I learned at that program about things like metacognition and affective domain, I have actually gotten to the point where I am now the executive director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at my university, with a staff of 15, teaching other faculty how to teach about metacognition and affective domain. And a huge part of this that I've found is the importance of hearing everyone's voice in the class and making sure that you create an environment for learning. So this is a microcosm of a classroom where you are welcoming and beyond welcoming, encouraging everyone's voice to be heard. And that concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion really runs through all of our programming and is growing in importance at our university, and I think across campus. Another thing that I think is critical for this is for particularly science classes to get rid of the myth of objectivity. I think a lot of my colleagues in science think, oh, I can't talk about these sorts of things. I'm a scientist. I do science in my class. Well, the reality is, if you look at every weapon of subjugation that happened this summer, the concussion bombs and the tasers and the smoke grenades and all of this, they were all, invented by physicists and chemists and designed by engineers. We're all implicit in these weapons of subjugation that have had the greatest impact upon communities, disadvantaged communities. And climate change is yet an extension of that in a variety of ways. So it's really important that all science classes recognize that we're not above the social impact, in sort of human aspects of how our science is used and incorporated. And it is critical that's addressed within science classes. And the last thing I'll say is it's critical as we develop our educational programs, not just classes, but educational materials and textbooks, that we do the same thing and we talk about these aspects of denialism, fake data, the cherry picking of data, how to recognize false information. These are critical to a science education because the information is not independent of the delivery of that information. And that if you do your students a lifetime disservice if part of their education is not how to recognize science when you see it, or recognize fake science, as was pointed out, that history of denialism, that Eduardo pointed out, this is a serious part of this whole aspect of climate and climate change. And we tend to avoid this with the sense that, well, if we just present our argument better, then an educated person will choose our view than the other view. And no, it goes beyond that. There is a concentrated, extended, decades, centuries long effort to deny the reality of these impacts, and this has to be addressed head on.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate your focus on the role of the scientist. I will say that in my classes, I have focused a lot on the creation of denialism, the creation of the hoax. I've got students listening to the Drilled podcast, which is excellent in going back through some of this history. And I think it's important for students in the business school to understand how people in their areas of study conspired with the corporations to create the myth. So there is some complicity as well. Let's go into our breakout rooms and invite everybody to get in on this conversation. So we invite everyone to turn on your video, unmute, join the conversation. We're going to go into breakout rooms. I'm going to ask so that our panelists can focus on the conversation, that someone, at least one someone in every group, step up and volunteer to be sort of a note taker and to help report back when we come back together. And here's the question. I'm going to put it into the chat. You won't be able to see it once we go to the breakout room, but this can start marinating a little bit. What are 5 core principles that should be taught to all college students, regardless of discipline or major, regardless of the subject expertise of the professor? And you may formulate your 5 core principles very differently from room to room, but let's go ahead and move into those rooms. I think we'll have about 8 folks in each room.
One little point, Kelly. Are we responding to the questions on the chat box after the meeting? There are 2 interesting questions there.
Why don't we come back to those questions? So let's go into our breakout rooms. We'll chat for about 15 minutes and come back and report out. And that ought to leave us a good 15 minutes for some Q&A.
Cool.
Great. Christine, I don't know if you also saw the link that Beth shared, because I think it might be of interest to you in your work with the Girl Scouts.
I did. Thank you.
Okay, great. Just wait one more second to make sure we've got everybody back. I think so. Okay, I think we're all back, and I hope there were note takers in the rooms to help us with our discussion. And maybe we'll just start with Eduardo's room. Is there someone who was in the discussion with Eduardo who can share with us a little bit of your discussion and what if you came up with 5 core principles? I think we came up with 10.
I think Eduardo should do that. So,
Eduardo, I invite you to share out.
So I'll do it quickly, but thank you, Bob, for also taking note during the meeting. We had a really nice group. What was interesting is that, the issues that came up kind of complement each other. And so I'll go through the list that we discussed very briefly, without any order in particular. So one, the importance of students to understand evidence in the data and evaluate the reliability of data. Second, the importance of understanding climate change impacts in context and the fact that there's no panacea to address climate change issues. Then 2 other points. One, the importance for students to understand the moral dimensions of climate change and the issue of, not necessarily the drivers of climate change are the ones that are mostly affected by that. Understanding the distribution and the variations of the types of manifestations of climate change, all the various ways in which it's manifested and distributed over time. Then the other point, which was interesting, is that in not every region there's an immediacy or a salience of the problem, and therefore people think about it in a very distant way from their lives. So bringing climate change to relate to people's lives, whether it's affect them locally or whether affect larger chains and supply chains and other aspects that may affect them indirectly. There was an important point also that was to understand the impact of climate change beyond humans. What are the implications of climate change to other species, to the environment more broadly? And finally, the issue of understanding that how different value systems, how different worldviews may affect the way people understand climate change and accept one explanation or another. So this is I think I believe I got and then one last point that on the, how through almost any aspects that we're concerned with in the broader human environmental issues, there will be a climate change related problem. So you can have different entry points to talk about climate change, whether it's urban planning, whether it's agriculture, whether it's environmental justice. So there's multiple ways in which to bring the issue to bear on importance to people. Thank you for the group. It was a really nice group, and we barely had a chance to start. So
I know we never have enough time, but that's a great conversation. How about in Kathy's room?
Victoria is going to report for us.
Great.
Right. Hi, Victoria. Okay, so for our groups, we had a great discussion. Again, like most of the groups, we were just getting into the good things, but the 5 kind of principles that we came up with are, 1, to understand the root systems of how we got into, this climate crisis in the first place. So understanding those economic, governance, and natural systems that have been the foundation for us being in this predicament now. Second, we said the capacity to act. So those skills in taking what you've learned in the classroom and how to apply those skills and act on them to make change. Third, would be the capacity to engage with those studying other disciplines, other fields from you. Fourth, we would say the capacity to engage with others across cultures. How do you engage with people who maybe don't have the same background educationally as you, different ethnicities, different communities? So that would be our 4th point, with how you should engage with others across cultures, and kind of share those ideas for making change and progress in the right direction. And lastly, we said that we kind of grouped together ethics and kind of your personal responsibility, like the other group mentioned, your part in making sure that our future is cleaner. So even the little things that you can do to help, what can those be? So yeah, those are our 5 points.
Oh, that's superb. Thank you so much, Victoria, for reporting out. And I'm going to ask those who took notes, I'll put my email in the chat at the end and ask you if you'd be kind enough to take a copy of them, a picture of them, and email them to me so that we can make sure we have all that. Great. How about Michael's room? Who can report to us on what Michael's room discussed?
Alex is, I think, going to report out for us.
Terrific.
I have some tough acts to follow. I'm also really impressed that you guys had 5 specific things. We had more of a general conversation, and we pulled out a couple things that tie in with some other themes we're hearing. So we kind of talked a little bit about some of the building blocks that would be important, like understanding the carbon cycle, and just in order to kind of understand the system through which climate and carbon work. But then we also focused a lot on the word's not coming to me, but we talked about compassion and just how important compassion is, and understanding our personal responsibility and having compassion for others, and having a really wide worldview. And then, we talked also about the importance of understanding our connectedness to the world around us, how we aren't just our individual selves or even just our individual community or just people, right? But we are all just so interconnected, and needing to understand that to really understand climate change and the impacts were important. So that was the direction our conversation went in.
That's wonderful. I'll go ahead and share my notes from my breakout room, and hopefully we can get into some Q&A, but if anybody in my room thinks I took bad notes, don't hesitate to jump in. We again emphasize the need for systems thinking, for interdisciplinary approach. Derek used the term, we need a common language. We need to make sure that when we use terms like, his example was built environment, when we use terms like that, that we all have the same definition of what we're talking about. Kathy and Christine both talked about the impact, the connection between the health of people and the health of the planet. How does climate change impact me? And some may think, well, I live far enough north, or I have plenty of air conditioning. How do we talk about all of the different systems in which they are connected and how they are impacted? Equity, of course, is a theme. Christine, who works with Girl Scouts, said we need to teach it early. So despite the fact that our focus has been on college curriculum, we need to teach it early, and we need to get students involved in projects for the environment. And Beth emphasized this as well, the need for real world practice. Be careful about making assumptions about what students believe. And then Nancy joined in and said, we also need to really give students advocacy and networking skills so that they can figure out some entry points and how to get engaged. So it sounds like we had discussions that have a lot of commonalities and yet some interesting different approaches from each room. So thank you to everyone. I want to open it up for some Q&A, and we had some good questions in the chat. And Eduardo, I think that you may have been looking at a few of these. There's a question from Beth. We find systems thinking to be a common language for our sustainability faculty and instructors, but they often prioritize very different aspects, methods around systems thinking, and we see some inter-university commonality and some conflict. Not really a question mark at the end, but I'd love to hear the panel weigh in on that.
I'll just briefly comment on this. I thought it was a good question. I think I'll put it together with another question from Eric Benson.
Great.
Which is on the role of the humanities. And I'll try to blend the two because, you know, one advantage of systems thinking is that you do a strong exercise of understanding what is connected to what and think more holistically about it. But systems thinking is also a way of reducing the complexity of the system. And you can do that in a way that it facilitates understanding or in a way that it simplifies too much understanding. One aspect that I think has been evolving in systems thinking is how to bring issues like values, worldviews, emotions, power relations to systems thinking analysis. You know, I'm thinking particularly here about kind of socio-ecological systems analysis, or you know, this kind of systems thinking. And I think this is actually in a frontier of research. How do we bring, you know, the contribution of humanities and more broadly of those working on questions of values, worldviews, emotions to the analysis that we do of the processes influencing and contributing, you know, either to exacerbate or to minimize climate change. So there's a large community in the humanities now that is emerging, and we see environmental humanities, for instance. You know, and you see all those aspects now become more important. And I mean, performing, you know, creative culture, you know, performance in songs and poems and all sorts of ways in which people are mobilizing to empower themselves to deal with climate change and other issues. That gives hope to people and that transmit knowledge. You know, I work in areas where a lot of the knowledge, including about climate, are transmitted through songs, through stories, you know, to other forms of communication that are now start to be valued. So it's a really interesting area of work and an area that we should move into and bring a, you know, a more nuanced perspective to systems thinking as we apply to climate change.
Michael or Kathy, do you want to jump in here and comment on what happened in your rooms or on this the questions that Eduardo has responded to?
I'm happy to say a little bit more about systems thinking, because I think systems thinking, and Michael can will also I think speak to this, but systems thinking it's an epistemological shift, right? It requires that you change from thinking about cause and effect to thinking about systems dynamics, and it requires that you shift from thinking about things as not connected to connected. And to me, so I think two things. One is that's the most important thing. And actually, I think that's the most important outcome of a science education and the most important outcome of a earth science education. And I think it's it needs to be one of the central outcomes of higher education. And Michael will speak to that as an outcome of K-12 education. So, I mean, that to me is the thing that is impeding our ability as a species to cope with the world in which we live at the moment. So that's really hard to do. There are people who study why that's hard to do. But I think following on Eduardo's thought, if that is so fundamental to, if that's hard and fundamental, it needs to be something we take on from all aspects. So how do we develop that shift in way of thinking through music, through art, through history, through everything? Because it's a very, it's like analogous to shifting from thinking the world has not been around for a long time to believing in deep time, or appreciating deep time. I mean, it's a really big shift. So, that to me is the first thing about systems thinking, and the most important thing. There are lots of tools and ways to make use of system thinking, modeling being a very common one. And it's my experience, it's at that level that the conversations become difficult, because different disciplines have different affordances from different ways of using systems thinking, and they all think their way is the most important. So, that's a problem that can be solved by giving people lots of opportunity to learn about systems in different ways. So, go systems thinking.
I think, and that shift has been more dramatic in some fields than others. Earth science in particular, but also life science. Science for a long time was considered, this is sort of equated with classifying. You list the names of the minerals and the names of the rocks and the names of the clouds, and you break all this down. But the inherent problem is, let's say you have a radio and you want to figure out how it works. Well, the historical approach is you take it apart and you look at all the transistors and the resistors and the speakers and everything. There's a problem there, though. You don't hear any music. You don't get to see what it does when you break it down into its pieces. And so it's putting everything together and looking at the pieces in a system. And Kathy mentioned the NGSS, and you're absolutely right. So, I think a big part of the success of the NGSS has been the incorporation of this third dimension. Right? There's the content of science, there are the practices of science, but there are also these cross-cutting concepts. And they, we ended up with 7 of them. 3 of them are systems related. So there's matter and energy through systems, there's stability and change in systems, and then there's systems and system modeling. Now, cause and effect is one of the cross-cutting concepts, and scale, proportion, quantity. I mean, we do have that reductionist view as part of these educational cross-cutting concepts, but it's dominated by looking at the content in this systems approach. And I think it has been remarkably successful in allowing the students to really broaden out their lessons across not just science, but then bleeding into history and geography and anthropology and other areas, because the whole point is to look at how, and then you see that your particular topic is really tied in, there's almost no limit to where the system can extend to.
Yeah, and I'm just looking at the questions, and I think that it's not just that the systems thinking can bleed from science or environmental science to other ways of thinking. Systems thinking is a perspective that if you if you have that perspective, fundamentally changes the way you see the world, right? It changes the way you see the interactions between people in an orchestra, or sounds in an orchestra, or certainly the way you understand economics. And so that's why I think it's such a fundamental thing, is it's a different worldview, and not a scientific or an earth science thing. So thank you, Kathy and Alex, for those points.
Are there any final comments from our panel as we get close to the end here, or any additional questions from the group? If you can put them in the chat or raise your hands, either one is fine. But Eduardo, I'll just come to you and see if you have any concluding remarks based on our conversation over the last 70 or so minutes.
First, thank you for the opportunity. What I take from here is that if I was participating or remembering some of the same conversation 3-5 years ago, I think it would be a very different conversation. And here, I think we got an appreciation from all the many aspects of the science, the social issues, the values, and the more humanist aspect of climate change that are kind of becoming integrated. So I think the panel reflects that direction, and I think is the right direction to go to, appreciate the complexity and the importance of all those issues in teaching and thinking about climate change. So thank you.
Kathy has posed a question in the chat. Does anyone have any information about effective approaches to train faculty to teach systems thinking or climate change principles within various disciplines? So I'll throw that out there and come then to Michael and then Kathy for thoughts and closing comments.
I'm going to let Kathy answer that question because yes, there's lots of good information at CERC through part of the one program I was participating in on the cutting edge, but many other programs, and Kathy leads that endeavor. So I'm going to leave that for her. I'll just say, it's very exciting for me to see the changes that have happened this year. This has been a rough year in so many ways. But there is this silver lining of this awareness that has come about in response to Black Lives Matter, the horrible killing of George Floyd. But what that has brought is this sense of issues extend beyond the limits that we've put on them, and they impact everybody, and they impact people in often unseen ways and often unjust ways. But we, through education, can really help have people move from sort of local to global concepts. And I think that is a critical thing for us. That it's almost like if you're a Hindu, enlightenment comes when you realize there's no difference between the Brahman and the Atman. Your individual soul and the global soul are the same thing. And I think in environmentalism, there is no difference between the local and the global. And I think when there is a sense of just awareness and enlightenment that comes when you make that realization. The saying is all politics is local. Well, the same goes for environmental work, and what you do in your block and your community, is part of this picture. And I think education is moving us that way, and I'm just encouraged by sort of a sense of global awareness, and I'm really excited by that.
That's wonderful. Kathy, I'm going to give you the last word on this, and I know you've been sharing some resources in the chat as well.
Yeah, I put in the Integrate project, which was really about teaching about the environment about the earth across the curriculum, and has both program models and curriculum materials developed by hundreds of educators on interdisciplinary teams across institutions and reviewed. CleanNet is another group that pulls together. We also work with, and those are also available through CERC, but we work with them and they review climate and energy resources K-12 and above. So, I think there are lots of examples. I guess my concluding thought would be to echo what Eduardo and Michael have said about the change in perspective and the role of this last year in accelerating that change in perspective. I think I was really impressed with the commonalities across what all of us talked about in our breakout groups. I don't think in this group you don't have to argue about, you don't have to make impassioned plea that interdisciplinarity is important, or that equity is at the center, or that the goal is action. And that's both very different than the conversation 5 years ago or even 3 years ago, and also that the local and global are interacting. That's all been accelerated by this year, not just the Black Lives Matter and Floyd incident, but also the COVID, watching COVID play out, which has also empowered us to think about doing things in new ways. So I think that the last question was the right question, which is it seems like we have some widespread commonality among what we're trying to do, and we can shift to thinking about how we do it. So
I'm so glad we get to end on a positive note. So again, I'll thank Dr. Catherine Manduca, Dr. Eduardo Brandisio, Dr. Michael Weissession, and the wonderful people who joined us today for our discussion. Let me conclude by telling you that the climate teaching and education discussion will continue in 2 weeks on November 6th. We're going to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Daniel Wildcat. He's a professor at Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas. He's also the director of the Haskell Environmental Research Studies Center. We'll then have a workshop session focused on from campus to community, educating today's climate experts. So those people specifically going out to work in the field of climate at graduation, students preparing for climate careers. We close November 20th with a session we've called A Rising Tide Must Lift All Boats, Redefining Workforce Development in a Green Economy to Ensure a Just Transition. I hope you'll join us for that. I thank everyone, and especially our panel, for their contributions today. Wonderful conversation. Have a great weekend, everyone.